Nafasi hii itamwendea Mheshimiwa wa Marakwet Magharibi, Mheshimiwa Timothy Toroitich. Mheshimiwa wa
wengi na uchumi uende kupanda juu na ile tax iweze kurudi chini. Asante sana Mheshimiwa Spika.
Asante Mheshimiwa Zamzam. Nafasi hii itamwendea Mheshimiwa wa Marakwet Magharibi, Mheshimiwa Timothy Toroitich.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for giving me this opportunity to contribute on this very important legislation that has been proposed, that is the National Rating Bill. Madam Speaker, before joining this Parliament, I worked in the County Assembly of Elgeyo Marakwet as a legal counsel. Madam Speaker, the biggest challenge that we have in this country is something called duplication of legislation, or, Madam Speaker, competing legislations. Madam Speaker, the quality of our legislation is determined by uniformity. Madam Speaker, if you realize, in this country, we devolve law-making powers to the county governments. So, Madam Speaker, what has happened is each county government is making a law to suit its own purpose. Madam Speaker, so that you find that in neighboring counties, each county has its own form of legislation. So, Madam Speaker, in terms of interpretation, if you buy a land that is adjacent to another county, when it's taken to court and there are different legislations governing a subject matter, it becomes challenging in the court addressing that particular situation. Madam Speaker, you also realize that the biggest challenge that bedevils county governments is the collection of revenue. Madam Speaker, the own source of revenue in the county governments has been a very big challenge, so that county governments rely heavily on the national government in terms of revenue. So, Madam Speaker, if we have such a uniform legislation in the country, then there will be an equal application of the law, so that we avoid county governments coming up with their own laws, which at some points, if it is subjected to the national law, then that law becomes incompetent. Madam Speaker, there is an interesting provision that I've seen in Clause 7.2 of that bill, which, Madam Speaker, says that county legislation shall be in compliance with this act. Madam Speaker, since we have several legislations in the county governments, and each county government applies the law in its own instance, then, Madam Speaker, we have a situation here where if there is a conflict between a county government law in terms of rating of property and the national law, then it is very clear under Clause 7.2a that the national law shall prevail. Madam Speaker, for me, that is a big achievement in this proposed legislation, so that there is a clear hierarchy of laws in terms of the rating of properties in this country. Madam Speaker, another plus that I've seen in this particular legislation is the creation of the National Rating Tribunal. Madam Speaker, for me, that is a big plus, because if you have a National Rating Tribunal, then it will assist this country in terms of solving matters to do with the issue of property rates. Madam Speaker, the problem that we have in this country is the backlog of cases in our courts. So if we have a tailor-made tribunal that is specifically meant to address matters to do with disputes in terms of property rates, then, Madam Speaker, Honorable Speaker, it will assist so much in terms of solving disputes in this country. Honorable Speaker, we now have a comprehensive legislation that will be able to handle matters to do with property rates in this country. Honorable Speaker, I was saying earlier that we have had haphazard legislations in this country when it comes to property rates. Honorable Speaker, each county has been enacting its own legislation. But Honorable Speaker, now we have a uniform legislation that will provide uniformity in matters to do with property rates and the rating of property in this country. So, Honorable Speaker, I fully endorse this particular legislation, in particular on matters to do with uniformity of laws in this country. Mr. Speaker, we have to relook clearly, because we devolved lawmaking to county governments. So what is happening at the county government is, one, you've said that disaster management is a county government function under the 4th schedule. What has happened? We have 48 different legislation on disaster management in this country. Land is devolved. But we have also allowed county governments to create legislations on rating of property. So we have 48 different legislations in this country in respect to rating. So what happens? When there is a conflict in a court of law in respect to, for example, the rating act of a certain county X, then it becomes very hard for the court to make a determination. But, Honorable Speaker, as I said earlier, there is a very clear provision under Clause 7.2, which says that county legislation shall be in compliance with this act. Honorable Speaker, meaning that if a certain county passes a certain legislation on rating, and there is a dispute in terms of application of that particular provision relating to a law in that county, then we have a check and balances in terms of the National Rating Act. So, Mr. Speaker, I encourage, personally as a lawyer, I encourage this kind of legislation, especially on matters that are devolved, so that in as much as county governments have powers to make law, then we should have a uniform national law to be able to check the excesses of a law that exists in the county government. Mr. Speaker, I beg to rest my case.
Honorable Toroitich, the Parliament normally benefits from your wisdom. I know you are anxious to rest, but you are also a very experienced lawyer.
Thank you.
If it is that the national government is to do laws cutting across all counties, then what would county assemblies be doing?
Honorable Speaker.
And number two,
yes,
just as you conclude, how would you deal with areas in which titles have not been issued, or areas where we have land group representatives, community lands? You know, areas like Masai land, areas like those vast areas of North.
That is...
And for that, don't hurry, you'll be added as many minutes as you want to clarify that.
Honorable Speaker, it is not only northeastern parts of this country that we have challenges of land that has not been adjudicated. Honorable Speaker, in my own county where I come from, Marakwet County, in particular my constituency, is that we have land that has not been demarcated, land that has not been adjudicated, and Honorable Speaker, we have no titles in those particular areas. We have faced challenges. For example, under the CDF, we are advised that you cannot allocate money to purchase land if there is no, we do not have, if that area is not, that school has no title deed. So we've had challenges in addressing such critical areas. And Mr. Speaker, I agree absolutely with you that in as much as we have this kind of legislation that purports to provide for property rights, we will experience the challenges in areas that has not been adjudicated. That is why, Mr. Speaker, we call upon the Committee of Lands, and the Vice Chair is here, to fast-track matters to do with land adjudication in this country and be able to issue titling. In fact, Honorable Speaker, where I come from, I have argued that the biggest challenge that you have on matters to do with conflict, armed conflict in our region, is because there is no absolutism in terms of ownership of property. So that land is communal, but the same one is also not registered under the Community Land Act. So that if land was registered under the CLA, the Community Land Act, then it could provide some form of ownership. Mr. Speaker, I've argued that if the government is intentional in providing permanent solution to the issue of conflict, then one of the issues is to provide absolutism in terms of ownership of property, so that each person has a title of ownership of property. And an individual would be protective to his parcel of land in case of any attacks. And even it could be able to assist those people if they want to acquire securities. They use securities to get maybe loans in banks. So, Mr. Speaker, I also call upon the committee so that, because even if we pass this particular legislation in this House, and I pray that it passes because it's a good law, then this law will not be applicable to areas that have not been adjudicated, to areas that do not have title deeds. And I think that is the biggest weakness when it comes to the application of that law, because it means, because, Honorable Speaker, almost 60% of this country, 60% of the owners of land in this country have land that do not have, they are in possession, but they do not have ownership. They just demarcate and say, this is our land, but they don't have the title of ownership. And this means that this law will apply to a section of this country and not the entire country as envisaged by this particular legislation. And I think that is a weakness that we must be able to address. Secondly, Honorable Speaker, you've raised a very fundamental issue. Article 191 talks about the issue of county governments making law. Honorable Speaker, we do not live in isolation. The boundaries created under the new Constitution 2010 is no longer new. I think it's a bit old. It's 13 years in effect. Are new boundaries. Honorable Speaker, these new boundaries separated communities that enjoyed certain cultural practices, certain rights, such that a particular county may pass a legislation that is offensive to another culture or that is offensive to another constituency. I mean, to another sub-county or another area. So, Chair, we should encourage cross-border legislations, especially on counties that share similar ideals. And I've read the standing orders of the National Assembly, which provide, I mean, of the county, most of the county governments, county assemblies, which provides of joint sittings between county assemblies of different county governments. And I encourage them to sit down and think of cross-border legislations so that we have a uniformity of legislations. Honorable Speaker, what is happening now in the county is a rush. What has been happening from 2010 to the current position is there has been a rush to make legislations to effect the fourth schedule on devolved functions. But these laws are a duplicity of other laws by the other county governments. Such that there's a lot of copy-pasting by a certain county to make a law because the law provides, because the Constitution provides that a function is devolved. I have given examples, Honorable Speaker. One was on liquor licensing. Different county governments have made different legislations on that subject, whereas we have the famous Muthuda law. So when it comes to interpretation by the courts of law, and these are two conflicting legislations. One is a national law that is in existence and was in existence before the coming of the county governments. Secondly, we have now county governments coming up with legislations on the same subject matter, so that when you go to court, there is a problem in terms with interpretation. And you know the law, the Constitution has devolved lawmaking to county governments. So, Mr. Speaker, it is an area that we need to review. We need to relook at that issue in our Constitution, so that we agree that if a national government has come up with a specific legislation, then there is no need to truncate it further to provide for other provisions which offend the national law. So, Mr. Speaker, in my opinion, in my submission, my position and my opinion is this, because that matter has not been fully adjudicated. If a matter is devolved and Senate, which exists to protect the interest of the county governments, if the Senate has made or has proposed a certain bill, and that bill has been enacted procedurally as by law, and the county government makes another law on that particular subject matter, then the national law should prevail if it is a matter that has been devolved. So, Honorable Speaker, that could be my submission, because I abhor that, and I like the way this bill has been drafted. It is very clear under clause 7.2. Honorable Speaker, it says, county legislation shall be in compliance with this act, meaning this bill, so that even if the county government, because we cannot also deny them the power to make law, because it is provided for by the Constitution. But the national law should provide a similar, the national laws made by the Senate, because they deal with the county governments, should provide a similar provision in all its legislations, so that if the county government makes a legislation that involves a devolved function, and the Senate has made a similar legislation, then this clause that the county legislation shall be in compliance with this act, meaning in terms, because it has been made by the Senate, it's a Senate bill, then, Honorable Speaker, the national law should prevail. That is my submission, Honorable Speaker.
Thank you, Honorable Toroitich, and I hope the committee listened to you on those two aspects. As I have said, it's always very nice to listen to you.